Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Bava Metzia. We are up to Perek Tet, Mishnah Yud Bet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Ranbai, Eliyahu ben Burchai, Israelov, Chana bat Miriam, Sason ben Ryan, Yoshua ben Shifra, Menuchatam began Eden, Amen. And Abdi ben Chaim Lechaim v'derefua shelemav, Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, Betoch Shachole Israel, and the Achlama Mera Benjamin Otzion Chai ben Dvorah. The Mishnah states what type of wages are required to be paid on time. Echad sechar adam, whether someone owes a person's wages for hiring a worker. V'echad sechar be'emar, payment for renting an animal. V'echad sechar kelim, or payment for renting utensils. Yesh bo mishum biyomot iten scharo. He is subject to the requirement to pay on time based on the verse in Dvarim, chapter 24, verse 15. You shall give him his wages on that day. And based on the verse in Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 13, you may not keep the wages of a worker with you overnight until morning. As we learned in the previous Mishnah, one of these verses forbids paying day workers later than dawn, and the other forbids paying night workers later than sunset. Both prohibitions apply to all forms of rental. If it is a day rental, it must be paid before dawn, and if it is a night rental, it must be paid before sunset. The Mishnah discusses when this prohibition applies and when it does not apply. Ematai, when does a person violate the prohibition against paying a worker late? Bisman shetivao, when the worker or the owner of the rented animal or object asked him for his wages and the employer did not pay within the proper time. Lo tivao and over alav, but if the worker did not ask him for his wages, the employer does not transgress the prohibition if he does not pay on time, because we can assume that the worker agrees not to be paid right away. The Gemara in 112a in Metzia derives from a verse in the Torah that the prohibition against paying a worker late does not apply in such a case. Himchau etzel chenvani. Similarly, if the employer directed the worker to a storekeeper, meaning he arranged for a storekeeper to give the worker food equal to the value of his wages, or etzel shulchani, or if he directed the worker to a money changer, meaning he arranged for a money changer to pay the worker, the employer asked the storekeeper or money changer to give the worker food or money and promised to pay him back, and over alav, the employer does not transgress the prohibition if the storekeeper or money changer does not pay the worker before the end of that day or night. The Gemara in 112a derives from a verse in the Torah that the prohibition against paying a worker late does not apply in such a case. Now, having discussed the proper time for various workers to be paid, the Mishnah teaches a law that applies during that time period. Sachil bismano, if a worker asks for his payment during the time when he is supposed to be paid, and the employer claims that he already paid him, nishba v'noter, the worker can swear that he had not been paid and collect the money from the employer. The worker is believed and not the employer, because we suspect that the employer is preoccupied with his business and simply thinks that he paid the worker, but he did not actually do so. Usually when a person claims that someone owes him money and the other person denies it, the defendant is believed as long as he swears that he is telling the truth. Sometimes the defendant is biblically obligated to swear, and sometimes rabbinic law obligates him to swear. Therefore, when a worker claims that his employer owes him money and the employer denies the claim, the defendant, in this case the employer, should be allowed to swear that he is telling the truth and be exempt from paying. However, the sages made an exception in this case. Since an employer is often preoccupied with his business, we suspect that he mistakenly thinks that he paid his worker even though he did not. Because of this concern, the sages ruled that the employer is not believed, instead the worker is believed as long as he swears to his claim. Avar zmano, however, once the proper time for the worker to be paid has passed, if the worker claims that he was not paid and the employer claims that he paid him, and no nishba v'noter, the worker cannot swear and collect his wages. Rather, the employer can swear that he paid the worker and he is exempt from paying. Because we assume that even a busy employer makes sure to pay his workers before the deadline, so as not to transgress the Torah's command against paying late. Therefore, once the deadline has passed, the employer is believed and not the worker. Since an employer usually makes sure to pay his workers before the deadline, after that time we do not suspect that the employer is making a mistake. Therefore, the usual law of claims applies, which means the defendant, in this case the employer, is believed. Now, the Mishnah refers to a case where neither the worker nor the employer has any proof to his claim. If either of them produces witnesses that he is telling the truth, then he would be believed. But if there are witnesses who testify that the worker asked the owner for payment right before the deadline and the employer pushed him off until later, then even after a deadline, the worker can swear that he was not paid and collect his wages. In this case, the worker is believed even after the deadline because the employer was clearly not concerned about missing the deadline. For example, a laborer worked the whole day Sunday and was required to be paid before Monday morning. Witnesses testified that the worker asked the employer for payment right before dawn on Monday morning, and the employer promised to pay later. The worker claims that he was not paid, while the employer claims to have eventually paid him. Since the testimony of the witnesses proves that the employer was not concerned about paying after the deadline, the worker is believed just as he is believed before the deadline. The Mishnah concludes with a unique case. Ger toshav yesh bo mishum biyomot iten scharo. If someone hires a ger toshav, a non-Jew who agrees not to worship idols, literally a ger toshav means resident foreigner. A non-Jew who agrees not to worship idols and lives among the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. If someone hires his ger toshav as a night worker, he is subject to the verse in Dvarim chapter 24 verse 15, you shall give him his wages on that day, and he must therefore be paid before sunset. Like we learned in Mishna 11, this verse refers to night workers. The Gemara explains that the wording of this verse implies that it refers not only to Jews, but also to anyone living among them, such as ger toshav. This is in the Gemara on page 111b in Bava Metzia. Ve'en bo mishum lo talin peurat sechir itcha ad boker. However, if he is hired as a day worker, he is not subject to the verse in Vayikra chapter 19 verse 13. You may not keep the wages of a worker with you overnight until morning, and therefore he does not have to be paid before the next morning. Like we learned, this verse refers to day workers, and the wording of this verse implies that it refers only to Jews. And that is then of Mishnah Yud Bet. The chapter ends with a new topic. If a borrower does not repay a loan when it is due, the lender may take an object from him as security for the loan. When the borrower repays the loan, the lender returns the security. Mishnah Yud Gimel discusses a number of laws that apply when taking an object as security. A lender can also take a security at the time he gives the loan, but such a security is not subject to this Mishnah's laws. Hamalveh et chavero, if someone lends money to his friend and the loan comes due, but the borrower does not repay it, Lo yimashikenenu ela bebedin. The lender may not take an object from the borrower as security except through a court, meaning the lender may not simply take an object from the borrower, but it must have the court send an agent to collect it. Velo yikanes lebeto litor mashkono. In addition, the agent of the court may not go into the borrower's house to take his property as security. Rather, he must wait for the borrower to bring out the object. However, the court's agent may take an item that he finds outside the borrower's house, but in the house, no. Shenema b'chutz tamod. It is stated in Dvarim, chapter 24, verses 10 and 11. You may not come into his house to take his security. You must stand outside. Now, the Torah commands in Shemot, chapter 22, verses 25 and 26, and Dvarim, chapter 24, verses 12 and 13, that if the security is an object that the borrower needs to use, the lender must return it whenever the borrower needs it. The Mishnah gives an example of this law. Hayu lo shne chelim. If the borrower had 2 utensils that the lender takes as security, he takes both objects because together they equal the value of the loan. And the borrower needs one during the day and the other at night. Notel echad u'maniach echad. The lender takes one and leaves the other one with the borrower depending on which one the borrower needs at that time. For example, if the lender takes the borrower's plow and pillow, u'machazir et hakar balayla ve'et ha'macharesha bayom, he returns the pillow every night and takes it back in the morning, and he returns the plow every day and takes it back at night. Now this applies only if the borrower has no other pillow or plow and cannot work or sleep without these items. The lender will think it worthwhile to take a security even though he must return it every day, because taking these items every day will encourage the borrower to repay the debt. However, if the borrower died and his heirs inherit his possessions, the lender does not have to return the security to the borrower's heirs when they need it, because the obligation to return a security when the borrower needs it applies only to the borrower himself and not to his heirs. This law is derived from a verse in the Torah. Since the lender does not have to return the security to the heirs, once the borrower dies, the lender can sell the security to collect his debt. Now usually, when a borrower dies before paying a loan, the lender may claim the loan only from real estate left by the borrower, not from movable objects he owned. However, if the lender was holding an object of the borrower's as security, he may collect the loan from that object after the borrower died. Now, according to this Tana, as long as the borrower is alive, the lender must continue to return the security item every day as long as the borrower needs it. The next Tana disagrees. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, even when the lender must return the security to the borrower himself when the borrower is alive, he need return it only until 30 days have passed. From 30 days and on, he can sell the security in court and keep the money as payment for the loan. 30 days is a standard amount of time given by a court for their orders to be carried out. Therefore, once the security is taken from the borrower, he has 30 days to come up with the money to pay back the loan. After that, the lender can sell the security. And the Rav tells us, Ven Halacha ki Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the Halacha does not follow the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Another prohibition that relates to taking a security, Almana ben shi aniya ben shi ashira en memashkinin otah. When a widow borrows, whether she is poor or rich, we may not take security from her. Shenamar, as it is stated in Dvarim, chapter 24, verse 17. V'lo tachavol beged almana. You may not take the clothing of a widow as security. Clothing is just an example. It is forbidden to take any object from a widow as security. The Torah forbids taking as security an object that is used to prepare food. As an example, it is forbidden to take millstones. The Mishnah elaborates, someone who takes a mill as security transgresses a prohibition. Moreover, he is liable for 2 transgressions, because a mill consists of 2 utensils, a bottom stone and a top stone. A mill consists of 2 round stones, one on top of the other. Grain is placed between them, and the top stone is turned, crushing the grain. Now the Mishnah refers to a hand mill, which was small enough to be carried and was used for grinding grain at home. Since the Torah mentions Shenamar, Lo Yachavol Rechaim Varechev, as it is stated in Dvarim, chapter 24, verse 6, he may not take the lower millstone or the upper millstone as security. Since the Torah mentions both stones explicitly, taking each one is considered a separate transgression, even though they are part of the same tool. The Torah did not simply say he may not take a mill, but mention both millstones, teaching us that taking each stone is a separate transgression. Although the Torah states only that a lender may not take millstones as security, the same applies to similar items. They did not say that it is forbidden to take only a lower millstone or upper millstone. Rather, anything that is used to prepare food, such as a pot, may similarly not be taken as security. Shenamar, as it is stated again in Dvarim, chapter 24, verse 6, Ki nefesh hu chovel. He may not take the lower millstone or the upper millstone as security, because he is taking a life as security. With this statement, the Torah teaches that the reason one may not take a millstone as security is because it is something that the borrower uses to sustain his life by preparing food, and therefore it is equally forbidden to take anything that is used to prepare food. And that is the Nabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.